Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Expanded Access Policies and Compliance in an Ever-Changing Environment, presented by the Working Group on Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access, also known as CUPA. My name is John Massarelli. I'm the CUPA Program Coordinator, and I will be today's moderator. I want to start by providing a bit of background for those less familiar with the work of CUPA. We are a 30-member, multi-stakeholder working group housed within NYU Grossman School of Medicine's Division of Medical Ethics. Our mission is to advance research, education, and policy surrounding ethical issues in access to investigational medical products. Our scope includes access to investigational products within clinical trials, as well as through the expanded access, also known as compassionate use, or similar non-trial pathways. The umbrella term that we use, which you might gather from the name of our working group, is pre-approval access. Each year, CUPA offers 2 webinars. The first is an introductory 101 style webinar, which you may have caught this past April, designed to provide the basics of pre-approval access. Today's webinar is part of our Advanced Topics series, which happens each fall and seeks to address a more specific and pressing topic within the world of pre-approval access. Recordings of these events and more can be found at CUPA's YouTube page, which we will include the link to in the chat. I'll also put in a plug here for our biannual conference, which will be happening this January 29th and 30th in person in New York City, and we'll be covering a broad range of hot topics in pre-approval access. If this is of interest to you, please mark your calendars and stay tuned for registration info. So today's topic, expanded access policies, is one that CUPA has wrestled with for some time. For patients who are seriously ill, have exhausted other options, and who do not qualify for a clinical trial, obtaining an investigational product through expanded access may be considered. As the final gatekeeper to their products, a sponsor company's stance on providing expanded access is very important for patients to know. Beyond just their stance, policies can be helpful resources containing eligibility criteria for expanded access, procedures for making a request, contact info, expected turnaround time, various educational materials, and more. Policies vary in what they contain and how they're posted, if at all, and some practices are better than others. Today's panel seeks to find some consensus about what expanded access policies ought to be. We'll start by laying out what the applicable laws and regulations say regarding expanded access policies before getting into relevant ethical considerations, what is helpful for patients in an expanded access policy, what current compliance with laws and regulations looks like, and finally, from a company perspective, what are the common challenges and what are the best practices in dealing with them? The final portion of today's event will be a moderated Q&A, so please feel free to submit your questions at any point via the chat, and we'll try to get to them at the end. Lastly, please keep in mind that today's webinar comes from a multi-stakeholder academic perspective and is not meant to be legal or business advice. With all that said, I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker to kick things off and give us our legal perspective on the topic. Rachel Sher is a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Manat, Phelps, and Phillips and leads the Food and Drug Administration practice there. Prior to joining Manat, Rachel led the policy department for the National Organization of Rare Disorders, NORD. Rachel also previously worked in the Commissioner's Office at the FDA, where she led the agency's engagement on the 21st Century Cures Act legislative process, and 10 years on Capitol Hill working as FDA counsel for the Committee on Energy and Commerce, where she oversaw the FDA-related portfolio, drafting and negotiating all major FDA legislation enacted during her tenure. Thank you, Rachel, for being with us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, John. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you to discuss this very important topic. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I'm here today to talk about really what the 21st Century Cures Act provision on expanded access actually says. Before I get to that, though, I wanted to just briefly provide a bit of context about how this provision ended up in the 21st Century Cures Act to begin with. As John mentioned, I was on Capitol Hill working on the Energy and Commerce Committee at the time the 21st Century Cures process really kicked off in early 2014. And by the time the 21st Century Cures Act bill became law in 2016. I was then at FDA handling that work on the FDA-related provisions at the agency. So 21st Century Cures started, as I mentioned, early 2014 with Representatives Fred Upton and Diana DeGette, who set out with an audacious goal of accelerating the, quote, pace at which our nation develops new cures and treatments for some of the most stubborn diseases in the world. And this happened at kind of an unusual time. As many of you know, the FDA user fee programs need to be reauthorized every 5 years. And that process had just wrapped up a couple years prior to that in 2012. So at first, it wasn't really clear how that process was going to go around this sort of what we call mid-cycle legislative effort in the FDA space. But throughout 2014 and 2015, Representatives Upton and DeGette held numerous roundtables and hearings on a broad array of topics relating to that very broad goal. They invited many different stakeholders throughout the pharmaceutical and medical device ecosystems to come forward and tell them what they thought needed to happen to accelerate treatments and cures. And patients were definitely part of the group that came forward to tell their stories. So over the course of those couple of years, the bill started to pick up traction, also in the Senate, and it became clear that it was really going to be a vehicle for moving forward with an array of FDA-related policies. So one of those topics was the expanded access policies. At the time, there was a bill that had been introduced, a bipartisan bill in the House at first, which was the Andrea Sloan Compassionate Use Reform and Enhancement Act, the CURE Act. And I put the press release from that introduction up here, which really tells a bit about the members and their motivation for introducing it. That bill ended up largely getting incorporated into the 21st Century Cures bill. The other thing that had been going on around the time was a lot of criticism of FDA and its role in reviewing all of the expanded access requests that came in. There had been a U.S. News and World Report article that referred to FDA's activity as, quote, bureaucratic absurdity and fatally flawed. So there was a lot of focus on what can we do to help FDA here too. And at the time, in June 2016, was when the FDA released its revised guidance that set out an expedited process to address some of those concerns through the form FDA 3926. The other piece that was happening at the time was around right to try. At that point in time, there were many state laws on the books, and partway through 2016, the Trickett-Wendler Right to Try Act had been introduced. Those provisions did not get incorporated into the 21st Century Cures, but there were a lot of conversations at the time around those right to try concepts, which is not the topic of this webinar. It's very different from the expanded access policy that we're going to be talking about. That law did become law a couple of years later in 2018. Next slide, please. So what does the 21st Century Cures Act provision say? And as I mentioned, this was a law that was enacted on December 13th, 2016. And it added a new section to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that requires, at a very high level, and these are the words from the statute, a manufacturer or distributor of one or more investigational drugs for the diagnosis, monitoring, or treatment of one or more serious diseases or conditions. That manufacturer or distributor has to make available the policy of the manufacturer distributor on evaluating and responding to requests for the provision of investigational drugs under 561B of the Federal Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, which is the underlying provision that had been in law for many years that governs how and when drugs can be made available through expanded access. Next slide, please. So the law is pretty explicit on the requirements. So I'm just going to walk through more of what it says. First of all, it says that the policies must be made public and readily available, and specifically says such as by posting such policies on a publicly available internet website. The policies may also be generally applicable to all of the investigational drugs of such manufacturer or distributor. Now, the guidance that FDA has issued on this provision goes on to say if there are different expanded access policies for different investigational drugs, each expanded access policy needs to be made publicly available with reference to the policies or to the products to which the policy applies. That makes sense as a matter of common sense, and so the guidance is explicit on that. Next slide, please. So here again are the requirements of what needs to go into the policy itself that is made publicly available. First of all, the contact information for how patients and their providers can find out about making the expanded access request to facilitate communication. The policy also needs to have the procedures for making such requests. What does the requester need to do under that policy? The policy also needs to spell out the criteria that the manufacturer or distributor will use to evaluate and respond to the request. The expected length of time for acknowledging the receipt of the request. And finally, a hyperlink or other reference to the clinical trial record with information on the expanded access program for the drug that is otherwise required to be submitted to the clinicaltrials.gov website. Next slide, please. So when do these policies need to be posted and made publicly available? When 21st Century Cures became law, the only timing requirement that was in place was at the first initiation of a phase 2 or phase 3 study. In August of 2017, a different law, the FDA Reauthorization Act, was enacted that added a second prong in terms of the timing. And specifically, it says, or 15 days after the drug receives a designation as a breakthrough therapy, a fast track product, or a regenerative advanced therapy. And to the first prong, FDA's guidance makes clear that FDA interprets the, quote, initiation of a phase 2 or phase 3 study to be when the enrollment begins. Next slide, please. So two other pieces that are actually set forward in the law is really an echoing of the long-standing policy that manufacturers cannot be forced to provide drugs through expanded access. FDA doesn't have that authority, and manufacturers do not have to do that under the law. The law says specifically that the posting of the policies by the manufacturer or distributor do not serve as a guarantee of access to any specific investigational drug by any individual patient. The law also makes clear that the policy as it's set forth at first doesn't have to be the final policy. Revisions to that policy can be made at any time. Next slide, please. Finally, just a word about what happens in the instance of non-compliance with these provisions under 561A. The Cures Act and all the subsequent legislation on this provision did not specify a penalty for violation. So this would fall under FDA's general enforcement authority for pursuing violations of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in general. They could issue untitled letters or warning letters to try to prompt compliance. That said, a recent search that we did of FDA's warning letter database did not reveal any warning letters for noncompliance in this case. And I believe that's my last slide, and I will turn it back to you, John.
Thank you, Rachel. That's crucial background for us as we move forward with this conversation, and it will sort of underlie, I think, all the other presentations that we'll hear from in the discussion at the end. So next, I want to introduce Cláudia Hirawat. Cláudia is the owner and executive chair of VAZ Advisors. Until 2015, she was president of PTC Therapeutics Incorporated. She volunteers with Eurodis, Rare Disease Europe, in international activities promoting the inclusion of the needs of patients with rare diseases in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 2030. She also serves as adjunct faculty in NYU Grossman School of Medicine's Division of Medical Ethics. Without further ado, over to you, Cláudia. I think you're muted.
Just trying to share my slides. I apologize. Just one second.
No problem.
Can you see them okay?
I don't see them myself.
You worked great when we tested.
Of course. There we go. Looks like they're coming.
Go back here.
Perfect.
Perfect. Sorry about that. Well, I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you, John, for the introduction. I am honored to represent the patient perspective, which of course is critical. And I'm speaking from my experience working in advising companies on developing policies and procedures for pre-approval drug access, and also as my experience as a patient living with a rare disease. My opinions don't necessarily reflect those of Coupa or NYU, just to be clear. For starters, I wanted to frame a little bit of what are the challenges for patients with the situation of understanding opportunities for access. General awareness is very low, so even knowing that such process exists is not usually the case for most patients. It can be very challenging to locate policies on websites. I do this day in and day out, and sometimes you have to dig really deep to find where those policies are buried. The language of those policies can be confusing. It can be unclear. The messaging is also unclear. They usually say how much they care about the patients and the hard work they're doing to develop therapies for patients. Then they often say that they are not providing access at this time to focus on their clinical trials. But then they go on to say you can have your physician contact them. And I think it leaves a lot of patients confused. It's a sort of a yes and a no and a yes, but it really means no, but you can have a conversation. The policies can be very general, where they talk about the general policy of the company across their entire portfolio, when in fact it can differ from one asset to another, and that subtlety can get lost. There is really no opportunity for patients or families to ask questions. For the most part, the policies I see offer an opportunity for a physician to put in an inquiry, but no resources for families to learn more. And while the initial communication may be fast, you will promptly receive some acknowledgement that your inquiry was received. A final decision can be very lengthy, and it's usually not specified what will be the time frame to receive it. In addition to those challenges, sometimes there is a lack of upfront information regarding the associated or indirect costs. For example, companies often provide their drug free of cost, but you may require a hospital stay or additional medications that the company might not cover. And it can take a while to find out that information, and for some families that is prohibitive. Program requirements sometimes are not specific or divulged, so the criteria that companies will use to evaluate those requests sometimes it's just at a very high level and doesn't give you enough information. For example, for a gene therapy company, there may be a requirement that you live within a certain radius of one of their clinical trial sites, and that might not be specified up front. You might put in an application where you don't live in there, and that therefore it gets discarded, when in fact, if you knew that, you might consider relocating closer to that site. So that's just one example, but there are many instances like that. Going to physicians is not necessarily helpful because a lot of them are not well versed in this process. There are certain disciplines that have more experience, in particularly oncology, where this happens more frequently, but in others, it's still completely unknown. And patients and families don't receive typically a reason for the denial. And there are a lot of very good reasons why that's the case. But from the patient's perspective, if you are aware, for example, of another patient with similar characteristics that did receive the access, it may seem unfair. So what does the regulation mean for patients? It offers an increased opportunity to learn about expanded access and the potential availability of a drug, just because the policies exist. And if you're browsing a website of a company developing a drug in your area of interest, you may find in the patients tab that there is a policy there that refers to this, and you may read it and become aware of that possibility. It provides a chance for the patient situation to be heard by the company, so illustrating to the company the need for that access for patients, as mentioned earlier, who have exhausted all other options and don't have the ability to participate in a clinical trial and just really can't wait for that therapy to be approved. I say it may influence companies to carefully consider each request because there is no real requirement that they do. In my experience working with lots of companies, both pharmaceutical and biotech, companies do take this very seriously and do consider it. I think my frustration is that at times they don't have a strategy ahead of time. So that consideration and deliberation is happening in real time. So the responses can take a very long time to come through, but it is taken very seriously. What is not currently addressed or not adequately addressed is there isn't generally enough information, even on that policy when you're talking about this mechanism that may have in existence. It doesn't really describe how things work in any level of detail. As I mentioned before, the language can be an issue, it can be confusing, the time frame for the response and for the final decision. It doesn't guarantee that requests will be fully considered, and it doesn't appear to me, in my experience, that they're currently enforced, and that's consistent with what Rachel shared with us. And if I could put together a very short wish list from all I've heard from patient communities on this topic, I think it's reasonable to ask that drug developers always have a patient tab clearly visible on their websites, where they may have policies such as this and other resources for information for patients. Of course, the request for plain language, and that companies, this is much more my opinion as someone who's in the middle of these discussions between companies and patients often, they should have a strategy in place ahead of time, even if for a number of reasons they don't feel that they will be able to provide the access. Having a strategy is very helpful, as well as having a system to decide on those requests and how to communicate those requests to patients, physicians, families. And I believe the legal requirement should be enforced. I think patients in generally would like for them to be always true. Well, thank you. This is a summary. I look forward to answering any questions later. That, I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Cláudia. That was very, very important and well said. patients are at the center of everything that we do at Coupa, I would say generally. So that was, really important, and thank you. Our next presenter is Sukhun Kang. Sukhun is an assistant professor in technology management at University of California, Santa Barbara. He received a PhD in strategy and entrepreneurship from the London Business School, and his research focuses on strategy and innovation with a particular emphasis on healthcare, biopharmaceutical, and the high-tech industry. Over to you, Sukhun.
Thank you so much, John. We learned a lot from Rachel and Cláudia, and I'm gonna talk about mostly about our research with my own colleagues that we did a few years ago. We try to assess the compliance rate of the pharmaceutical companies to the 21st Century Cures Act. So just to briefly, next slide, please. So this is the screen capture of the act that we sort of paid attention to. I think Rachel had sort of went over this carefully, but just to remind you, there were some requirements for the companies in terms of what should be on their website and what content they should consider posting on their website if they are gonna do it. I think mostly these were sort of this, it sounded like suggestion. Maybe the companies may have not completely understood what the compliance requirement was, but our understanding, our question was to try to see whether there's any company characteristic that's sort of related to the compliance rate, so we can better understand what's sort of making them comply versus what's not, what's making them not comply. So to understand how we can improve the policies. So next slide, please. So these are some of the examples of the expanded access policies we found on their website. As you can see, some companies have their separate page for the expanded access, while some don't. And even the format of the policies are somewhat different. Although, there's some of languages and the qualitative aspects of the contents are somewhat similar. Next slide, please. So what we did in this research that's appeared on the CPT in 2021 is we try to be comprehensive. We didn't want to make any judgment around, because there are some subtleties in the languages, right? So we wanted to make sure we are comprehensive in capturing what they have on their website and what they have not on their website. So what we did was we looked at all the oncology companies that have phase 2 or 3 drug that has been launched in past 20 years or so, even before the act enactment. And we actually manually looked at their website. We went to their every web page they had available. We even used the Wayback Machine, which is the archive of their websites that could sort of shed light on when they posted their expanded access policies on their website. So if you go to the next slide, I'll give you some description on the data. So there were about 423 US-based oncology companies, which we think is a safer sample of the companies that should comply to the Act requirement. And the variables that we collected was whether the policy was available publicly, either on their website or wherever. We couldn't really go to every web pages, but we tried Googling it. We went to every web page of their website, but not the websites of the other sort of publicly available places. So we try to be comprehensive. We Googled the company name, expanded access, and if the policy is posted on their website or any other public place, we checked whether they met the contents requirement that are specified by the Act. And on a separate note, what we did was we collected the company level information in terms of number of employees, number of portfolio drugs, whether they have received venture capital or corporate venture capital, if they are biotech or startup company, if they have phase 3 drug in their portfolio. I think it matters a lot for their resource constraint, etc. So what company characteristics are likely to be associated with the compliance rate and the level of compliance? Next slide, please. So just short answer to that is 32% of the companies had their expanded access policies posted on their website or publicly available place. And most of the disclosed policies had included contact information. It claimed that on average, it takes 5 days or less, and had separate web page. However, there's significant variation in terms of whether they were the link to the clinicaltrials.gov, which they have to register their expanded access. And also, what it showed was that publicly listed companies and larger companies in terms of number of employees and companies that have revenue that are greater, and also that companies that have more advanced pipeline drugs in their development were more likely to comply. So these are the descriptive statistics of what we found. Next slide, please. So it's hard to tell why they couldn't comply or they complied, but based on the data descriptive statistics we have, we might think that there may be some financial or resource constraints that are limiting companies' ability to comply with the federal mandate. For example, if a company has only one portfolio drug that's starting a phase 2, their resource commitment and their sort of the number of human capital commitment should be sort of devoted to the R&D. Maybe they don't have enough resources to take care of the expanded access. And also drug companies that had more advanced drug development status had higher compliance rate. We think that might be due to the fact that they have more likely to have interacted with the FDA or regulatory agencies personnel. So I was personally a caregiver for cancer patient too, and I think patient and the physician community, including doctors, I think would benefit from a better consensus on the policy contents. And I think Ken will go over this too, but it doesn't have to be yes to the expanded access, right? It can be no to expanded access. It just has to be transparent and publicly available beforehand. Next slide. That's it. If you have any questions on my research, please let me know. And I know Jennifer Miller of our Coupa group has a couple of additional research papers in the BMC research notes and JAMA Network Open, so please check them out too. Thank you.
Thanks, Sukhun. And I just dropped the link to that paper that you were referencing in the chat. That paper is definitely like the first of its kind, and has really given us a lot of insight into this space, which can be a little bit nebulous. So the industry or the business perspective that Sukhun just got into a little bit, and now Ken is going to get into, is so important here. Thank you, Ken, for being with us. I'll turn it over to you to get started.
Sure, and thanks again for the invitation. So let's go to the next slide. But the title of this starts off with we've heard the legal aspects and patient views, and these are all so important as we think about expanded access. And then there are the practical realities about creating a policy. And the headline on the slide, "Nothing is absolute," is kind of the way I think that everybody needs to think about this. And this is taking a company perspective, as John just mentioned. And there are a couple of questions in the next two slides. But I think that when you think about an expanded access program, and I know there are many companies on this particular webinar, there are the risk benefits to the program that really need to be considered. There are certainly risks to the overall development efforts. I think through my personal experiences and many of the experiences of others, in well-structured and well-thought-through programs, there can actually be benefits to the drug development efforts, and also, of course, the benefits to the patients. So kind of the win-win situation. I think the next point, as we brought up a couple of times, is the legal requirements are set, but increasingly, and there are again a number of papers written about this, including some by the Coupa group, for certain companies, the requests for and pressures on those companies to provide their experimental medicine earlier are there before phase 2. So those companies really need to think about what their policy should be. And I think the next point's really the most important point in the way I think about things. The law is written all about companies providing contact information and people and turnaround times. The law doesn't think about the fact that it may be very appropriate for companies to say, not at this time. And that's been brought up by a couple of the speakers on this call. And then there comes the next point, which is there are no solid lines. Everything, Cláudia made the comment, and I wrote it down, about providing the information and the specificity of why somebody's denied. I think I'd look at that a different way, which first off, it's very appropriate for a family or an individual to do everything in their power to gain access to an experimental medicine if they think it can be helpful. But there's also the recognition that there are no solid lines, that if you say, here are our reasons, people will say, well, I don't like your reasons. I'd like to ask you again, ask again or ask more, or start programs to counteract your no, if you will. And I think that needs to be taken into account as companies are thinking about this. The comment about having a strategy is absolutely true, but I think it's Mike Tyson who said, everyone has a strategy until they're punched in the face. And I don't mean to be funny about this. It's just that no matter what your strategy is, the lines are fuzzy, and people will try and ask you about those lines. And there are a number of great examples of that. People have said our expanded access policy is only for patients over the age of 18. So a 17-year-old comes forward, 17 years and 10 months. What do you do then? Or, it's a genetic profile that looks like X, and somebody comes forth with a genetic profile that's very close to that. So everybody needs to understand that parameters are important, but they're not absolute solid lines of yes and no. And I think that really leads to companies thinking about the specific questions they want to ask in thinking about whether or not to set up their expanded access program. So let's go to the next slide. I put on paper, and these will be made available. Some of the short-term questions, if you will, in the next slide, some of the longer-term questions that companies need to think about in deciding whether or not to make their experimental medicine available under an expanded access program. How do you answer a request for a single patient when the drug's not broadly available to others? So, there will be situations where you have a friend, or somebody offers you money, or a politician calls you for access. How do you say yes to that person or for that need and no to others? These things need to be thought through. Should social pressure, should social media, should special connections play a role? And if you say yes to one person, how do you say no to others? What are the parameters of that? If doses are limited, how do you make those decisions about availability? Coupa has done certain things with large companies that have been published about setting up programs to really help with that evaluation process. What are the ethical considerations? There are questions, and these are really societal questions as well as company questions. What about age? What about different parameters of patients? Are there absolute distinctions, or are these kind of fuzzy distinctions? Age is clearly one, an 18-year-old versus a 17-year-old, a child versus an adult. These are all, questions that come forth. And I think one of the important points here is that companies need to think about whether they want to be proactive or reactive, whether they want to think through these questions in advance, which I suggest is the right way to do it, versus kind of wait around and hope nobody asks. And people do ask. The real important question for this and the next slide, which we can go to, is that the decisions for the answers to these questions all rests with the management of a company. And Sukhun made the comment about smaller companies and maybe they don't have the resources. And I think we can make a pretty general assumption that smaller companies don't have the resources that larger companies have when it comes to thinking about expanded access programs, or about having extra capital to fund these programs. So there are a lot of complexities in small companies that don't exist for larger organizations that have revenue. So then these are really the broader long-term questions about risk to programs, or if you're a smaller company and you're public, what happens if something goes wrong? And there are a lot of examples. I've certainly written about that myself, but there are examples about these things. If the process for some reason slows down the program, and I think this is one of the important things that needs to be considered and is hard to consider, which is, do you do something for the patient right now there? And what happens if it risks an impact on a larger group of patients in the future? Who's arguing for the lives of those future patients? And again, since those decisions lie with the management of the company, it's really the management team, the scientists and the business people, who have to think about that very, very complex issue. Okay, there's a person right here now who needs this drug or wants this drug. And in doing so, I'm risking a program that might delay future access. So who's advocating for those future patients? And I think it's fair to say there's no simple monolithic solution. There's no one size fits all. Each drug has its own patient population, regulatory strategy, development program, stage of development. So it may well be that an organization wants to say yes for a particular experimental medicine, but it's equally within their right, and there may be very good reasons to say no, not at this time, but we hope in the future. So with that, I'll just stop here, and thanks for the opportunity to share this perspective.
Thanks a lot, Ken, and thank you to all of our panelists for such insightful viewpoints, all informed by all your experiences in this field and dealing with this topic. Really great to have this diversity of viewpoints here today for this discussion. I'm glad we've ended a little bit early because now we have a little bit more time for the Q&A and the discussion. If you haven't already submitted a question and you'd like to, feel free. I'll be monitoring the Q&A over the next 18 or so minutes that we have left. The first question I want to raise is one that gets into sort of, it's a basic question, but it is important, and it talks about the terminology that we use. And there's so much terminology in this space, and it's often confused. So I'll ask this of Rachel. Can you explain the difference between expanded access and compassionate use or pre-approval access? And are all of these the same thing?
It's a great question, and one that if you take a look at FDA's guidances on expanded access, they recognize that there's a lot of confusion out there about the term. The short answer is there is no firm answer in the law. I think as the FDA guidance points out, these terms are terms that are used by different stakeholders at different times, usually to mean the same thing. In FDA's guidances, they largely refer to it as expanded access, and indeed that's what the terminology is. It's actually in the statute, both in the language that was added by 21st Century Cures that we were describing, but also in Section 561, which has been in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act for a while. So expanded access, I think, is the term that is typically used because it's used in the law, but you will see these terms being used interchangeably quite often. So it's clear there is a lot of confusion, and again, it's a very good question.
Can I add something to this? Because I'm kind of the one responsible for Coupa's name being both compassionate use and pre-approval access. And that's because if you don't provide an experimental medicine under compassionate use, does that mean you're not compassionate? As I said, there are a lot of reasons, including the needs of future patients. So I've been the proponent of pre-approval access to an experimental medicine. Now, that's a long sentence, but just a way of thinking about it, because I think compassionate use leads to people saying you didn't do it, therefore you're bad, which is kind of the way legislation actually was written, in my view, that this legislation says kind of, you will do this, whether there are teeth in it or not isn't the point. And if you don't do it, it implies badness. And that's really not the case. There are a lot of complex decisions that need to be made. So think about it as a medicine's not yet approved. It's still in the development pathway. Therefore, it's pre-approval, and we're giving you access to it. And here's why.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks, Rachel. I guess, Claudia, I'd like to go to you for this next question. This is, as we've just unpacked here a little bit, this is a very complex area, and there's legality to it, there's regulations, there's business reasons things are done. Could you speak from like a general patient perspective? There must be a big learning curve, and I assume early on in the process, patients have no idea about these things. Could you just speak to, how a patient might confront an expanded access policy and explain a little bit of that learning curve and what they need to do to really understand what companies are doing?
Sure. The challenge is that a lot of patients don't even understand the terminology, so they may not realize that that's what they're looking for in that website. So ways to have information that can connect more easily would be helpful. That says, if you have this specific need, here's what you should know, and having information that describes that. But in terms of navigating the process, it's also very helpful for patients to speak to patient advocacy groups. They usually have good knowledge of the mechanisms for access, and learning a little bit about how they work. They also provide some history in terms of what has been done before, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and that's a helpful connection. So always turning to a patient advocacy group can be a big resource.
Thanks, Claudia. Another question I have is thinking about the fact that there are really no teeth to the regulations. Is there any sort of business or economic reason, this might be for Ken or Sukhun, business reason that a company might want to get their ducks in a row and have an expanded access policy? Say they don't care about compliance, but they care about making money. What do you think about that? Is there a sense that having an expanded access policy implies that a company has its ducks in a row?
No, I just don't think that many. The companies that don't have them probably haven't thought enough about them. Again, since you have the right to say no, it's pretty easy. And just for folks on this call, we've talked about this internally at Coupa as to whether or not it would make sense to provide a short policy statement about what no might look like. We're sorry, but at this time the drug's not available under expanded access. That's simply doable. I think it's just that smaller companies in particular haven't spent a lot of time thinking about this at that early stage of development. I mean, they're small organizations. Their money, the money they receive, if they're private, the money they receive from their investors is to develop the drug. It's and so expanded access can be a distraction, much as that's hard to say when you're talking about people's lives, but from the main development program, and they have to think about that. But if they don't have a policy, a real easy one is we don't make the drug available at this time.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, Ken really put it up nicely, but I feel like each company has different. They're all in different status of development stage, and they would feel differently about same development stage as well. Whether their drugs can be actually safely provided. So I feel like it's really hard to tell why they wouldn't comply, or they are worried about saying no, look badly upon them. It's hard to tell, but I feel like we have to be careful in terms of how we think about not providing expanded access. Not a bad thing. I think they're doing their R&D, but when they can, they should be considered. The option should be considered. I think that's sort of the most important thing.
Yeah. And I think we want the answer. We want everybody to have it right now. But, from a perspective of time, the whole industry has come a long way in terms of making available or making clear what their policies are. We're not there yet. And I think slowly but surely, this will just become a natural part of company statements, whether it's for or yes or no with regards to expanded access.
Just a quick follow-up, Sukhun. You mentioned in your slides that certain resources might be required, and I may have missed this. It was resources are required for expanded access, I'm sure, but are there certain resources or personnel required at a company in developing expanded access policies? And Rachel, I don't know if you want to add anything here about certain.
I think Ken knows more about this.
Yeah,
But
it's a clinical protocol for starters. You've got to develop the protocol. If it's a single patient, it's filed by the physician, but it's the utilization of a company's drug. So, no company's going to let their experimental medicine be used without some level of involvement, at least in the writing of the protocol. And if it's an intermediate or large size protocol, it's got to be written, approved by the FDA, or not disapproved by the FDA, if you will. And it requires resources. So, there are company resources that are involved, and personnel and distribution and shipping and all those things that a company will have to do to make the experimental medicine available. So there are human and financial costs, if you will, to the company that are just within the purview of doing an expanded access program.
And just like responding to this request, I think also requires additional human capital. I feel like
Yeah.
my caregiver hat of 5 years ago, I wrote to maybe 50 companies, and you'll get really variation in terms of who's responding to the request, whether you get a response or not. So I think that really speaks to the sort of where there's a personnel that's dedicated for expanded access or patient affair versus small biotech where one person may be playing 3 different roles and they get a request for expanded access. It gets easily buried in their inbox, I think.
Thanks, Sukhun. I've gotten a couple questions about requests and the physician's role in making an expanded access request. I'll ask this of Cláudia. What happens when a physician is not willing or not familiar with expanded access and then not willing to be involved with a request? And then I guess a second follow-up to that question would be, if requests are declined, and are there reasons given typically, or is that kind of unclear?
Mm-hmm. There's a big difference between the physician knowing about the mechanisms and being willing to request. So knowing, it's in a way maybe easier to help, because if the patient is interested, he or she can bring resources to that physician. And there are many resources, including the Coupa website, that can explain how things work. And there are examples of access that has been very successful. I do want to point out, just a little bit connected to the previous topic, that there are a lot of very good reasons for companies to consider pre-approval access, including guaranteeing approval in different patient populations. And I have examples of where that has happened. But so the knowledge is easier to solve. The willingness, sometimes I've seen cases where the physician just didn't think the patient really stood to benefit. The patient was too advanced. There were too many issues, too many other health issues. And the physician didn't believe that this was a prudent course of action. In those cases, I think patients would do well to listen to their physicians if necessary, get a second opinion, but be prudent about what you are engaging into. And that's a very difficult, very personal decision. But if the physician is not willing just because it is complicated, it's a lot of work, then you probably don't have the right physician advocating for you. And I would consider, again, connecting with a patient group and hear their thoughts on this, but securing a second opinion and going to the greatest expert on that disease that you can find that is within your reach, because I think the more that they are specialized, the more likely they are to consider it. And I forgot the second question.
The second question was just about reasons for denial if an request is denied.
They can be very subtle. I think that there are easy reasons to answer, to say there's not enough drug. We've seen that with a lot of our gene therapy or cell therapy companies that just can't produce enough. But there are more complicated reasons where maybe several patients have requested access And in evaluating them, the company decided to provide it for patients where they thought a benefit was more possible, and denied those that they felt would not necessarily benefit from the drug. And that's a difficult decision to be transparent about, because I think families will often feel that it doesn't matter, we just want a chance. But especially with the finite resources of the company, some very difficult choices have to be made.
Ken, I'm sure you could speak to that and sort of the pressure that is on companies in certain situations. I'll hold that for a second, though. I want to go to Rachel to talk about. I want to ask if there's any sort of precedent for enforcing a policy of this nature. Are there other similar policies that have been enforced in a way that was helpful? Or is there any other laws or similar laws in other jurisdictions where perhaps enforcement has been done in a way that could be applied here?
Well, I can't really speak to other jurisdictions. I can say that within FDA's jurisdiction, there are numerous other provisions in the Act that get a lot more specific about the steps that FDA has to take when enforcing those provisions. So some actually spell out specific penalties for failure to comply. Some actually spell out and place it within the Act in terms of adulteration or misbranding. So this provision doesn't have those things, but it is an affirmative requirement under the Act. So there is enforcement authority, but it's a little more amorphous in terms of the process not being spelled out in the statute itself.
So now we have 3 minutes left. Maybe we'll get another question or two in. This question comes in from the Q&A, and it says, from the clinician side, there are smaller drug companies that do not have and sometimes are not willing to provide a protocol or treatment plan for single patient INDs. The burden then falls upon the clinician to draft one if they want access to the drug. Are there policy discussions about how to change and improve this scenario? Anyone aware of?
I just think that people need to realize if a company doesn't have an expanded access program some companies just don't want to do it at the particular point in development. I don't think it's likely that they're going to let their experimental medicine be used under a protocol that's not written by the company and approved by the company. I think that those are just some of the realities of drug development. Mm-hmm. It's a complex business, and we've all come to believe that drug development is easier and easier. And frankly, I think all of us on the call and all the people on the listening in know that's getting harder and harder. There are just so many complexities and so many places that an experimental medicine can fail. So, I that's my only thought on the particular question you raised.
Thanks, Ken. So this might be our last question. This is one that is pretty core to Coupa. We focus on pre-approval access and often expanded access, compassionate use, but we always say that clinical trials are the gold standard, and clinical trials should not be sacrificed for the sake of expanded access. This question asks, are there any comments on the broad pharma response or implied response that they are focused on drug approval, and any data gathered outside the construct of a carefully controlled clinical trial with well-informed trial sites might increase the risk of negatively impacting the core clinical trial? Does anyone want to just speak to this topic and perhaps how it factors into company policies and companies' decisions?
I thought I tried to hit on that. Things can go wrong at any point, and expanded access does have risks. It also can have great benefits. And from personal experience and from people I've talked to, there are a lot of people who run expanded access programs and learn things about their experimental medicine that they might not have learned otherwise. So, I don't think you can make a blanket, things are going to be negative, but that's a risk you have to consider. Nor can you make a blanket, things are going to be positive, because you don't know. So, I think you have to look at both sides of that equation. It's just that's the risk benefit balance that I think we're talking about, even down to the decision of whether or not you have an expanded access program for your, phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3 experimental medicine. I mean, post phase 3, when you have the data in hand and you have an expanded access program, that's just, you already know it works. But before then, and I think, Cláudia knows very well my experience, you don't know if it's going to work. And also, a drug that works for some patients can still not succeed in a clinical trial. And we just have to be aware of the extreme risks in drug development. So, there are a lot of reasons to do it. There are a lot of reasons not to do it. And that's the balance. And the future patients are one of those questions, and what you learn is another.
Thanks, Ken. So we're a minute over time. I should probably wrap things up now for all of us. Thank you to all of you attendees, but also thank you panelists for such insightful comments and contributions here. This is an ongoing conversation that we will continue to have at Coupa. And yeah, I guess that does it. Thanks everyone.